When you're watching in person or watching the recording here. As Patrick mentioned, my name is Alex Hamerstone, and I am the Advisory Solutions Director here at TrustedSec. I've been here about 11 years, and I'm very fortunate to work with organizations really of all sizes and industries using multiple different frameworks and standards. And I am joined by Jared McWherter, who's a security consultant here as well. So Jared, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep, thanks, Alex. Yep, definitely happy to be here. I've been with TrustedSec as well for about 3 years now. I work on the maturity advisory team, mainly working in the NIST CSF side and the program maturity assessment side. So definitely happy to be here and speak on the changes to the NIST CSF and some tips on implementation.
Very much. So just to walk through really quick, a quick agenda, for our webinar today, which we're very excited about. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the NIST CSF and why it's been successful and why so many people seem to be very happy with using it, how it maybe relates to a few other standards and frameworks out there. What's changing, in really the first, wholesale kind of redesign in about a decade of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Some insight into how to start implementing it if you haven't, whether it's a CSF in general or 2.0. And then really some tips on how to migrate when you've been using the previous versions to the update. We're certainly seeing a lot of organizations reaching out to us to ask us, how to get started with that, and especially around if you've been using the cybersecurity framework to track your maturity and progress. And now there's kind of a different set of, domains and controls. How are you able to kind of merge those together and kind of show the progress? So to start off, the NIST cybersecurity frameworks, again, it's been around a while. We've really watched it grow in popularity and adoption. And I think that's good news for a lot of organizations. Myself, I've been around the ISO world for a long time. Was a provisional auditor a long time ago, and am currently an ISO lead auditor, and along with a number of others on our staff. And I've been able to work throughout my career and currently with all different kinds of standards and frameworks. I used to be a QSA, so worked a lot with PCI. Work a lot of other NIST standards out there, as well as the CIS, ISO, a lot of the different financial regulations. Also, it seems like so many different industries now have their own standards and frameworks that they're pushing. So I get to work with a lot of those as well. But the CSF is really, I think, been ingrained in a lot of organizations as just a really good way to look at the entire information security program. And really the domains have been very focused on the different things that really are important, not just from a control perspective, but from a process and documentation perspective. Another big advantage, of course, that it's free. If you consider it free, of course, we pay for it with our tax dollars, through a great organization, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It really is designed to be flexible and fit into organizations. And I think with 2.0 become much more flexible. There was always some challenges, I think, with organizations, given that the CSF was really designed for critical infrastructure. And so some of the different domains and controls may have been less relevant for organizations, and without really weighting the different scoring and different domains and subdomains and controls, it could lead to maybe a bit of a skewed view of maturity. One thing I also like to point out is a lot of people will just talk about NIST and they'll ask, are you doing a NIST assessment? Are you using a NIST standard? And they mean the CSF, right? Of course, NIST has a lot of other standards, not just cybersecurity and IT. They have standards around brake pad thickness and, all kinds of other things. So, of course, here we're talking about the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework. But really, it has been, for organizations that I've seen use it and worked with, a great way to look at all the different domains, look at it really holistically, as much as that's an overused word. And also looks at, not just the controls in place to prevent, but also, to respond and recover from cybersecurity incidents and issues, and really goes a long way with that. And again, one of the things I like most about it is because it looks at maturity, is that you're able to kind of take your assessment, use it to design initiatives, and then act on those initiatives, and then reassess and kind of show maturity over time and how it's improving. Not just from a security program perspective, but also for all my friends and everybody else that works in information security. It's oftentimes very difficult to come up with kind of metrics that matter. And I think that, showing the maturity in the different domains is certainly an effective way to move towards that. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jared to talk a bit about some of the ways that the CSF is changing.
Yep, thanks, Alex. All right, so the most significant change as we moved into 2.0 is the introduction of the govern function. Now, I'll speak a little bit in just a moment on what the various functions are and how they work, but the govern function essentially, it is introduced as a standalone function. However, it is really meant to kind of streamline and inform all of the other functions in the NIST CSF. As you can see between or on the right-hand side here, it is a standalone function, but it really incorporates all of them. Now, if you want to move to the next slide. Yep. All right, perfect. So this is the CSF framework core. The CSF is made up of individual functions as stated, and that is govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Each one of those functions has individual categories into them and then subcategories, which are essentially the controls. I'm going to speak on the functions in just a moment, and then we can take a look at the categories and subcategories. Now, as I stated, the govern function, that is the newest function. The govern function, its main purpose is to essentially monitor the overall organizational cybersecurity strategy and integrate strategy within the broader enterprise risk management program. Now, this function, when we look at the rest of what makes up this function in just a few minutes, you will see a lot of the controls that are in the govern function will be familiar, as a lot of them have moved from other functions. There's been a lot of migration of categories and subcategories in the CSF here. Now I'm going to run through these real quick just so we have an understanding of what they are. That is the govern function. The identify function, that is essentially understanding the risk that we are looking to tackle, essentially. So that is assessing assets, assessing all the organization's assets, any kind of related vulnerabilities. Essentially, the identify function is to just identify what are we looking at, what are we trying to protect, and what is going to inform the risk management strategies as a whole. Now, moving beyond that, the protect function, that is essentially implementing safeguards to secure the assets that we identified in the identify function. So the protect function, that is for the security or securing assets, essentially any kind of hardening. The purpose of that is to enhance system resilience. This includes subcategories such as identity management, data security, and infrastructure protection. The detect function, that focuses on the timely identification and analysis of cybersecurity threats to essentially enable effective incident response through the monitoring and detection of potential security breaches. So as you can see, each one of these builds on each other. We need the govern function to tell us how to manage the overall strategy. We need the identify function to tell us what we are protecting, the protect function on how to protect, and then the detect function that builds on this to actually monitor and understand the subcategories, the controls that we have implemented in the protect function, and then this feeds into respond. Respond takes all of those functions that we already talked about, and this is responding to any kind of cybersecurity incidents. So essentially what this is containing, once we have detected a cybersecurity incident, the respond function is utilized to contain the impact of any kind of incident through coordinated incident management and communication strategies. And then lastly, we have recover. Recover comes after respond in the sense that once we have responded to the incident, recover is to facilitate the restoration of operations and assets following an incident, essentially ensure timely recovery and effective communication. Now, each one of these goes into categories. Each one of these is built by categories, which are built by subcategories, which we can see in the next slide here. Do you want to jump to the next one real quick?
Right,
Thank you.
My mouse wasn't working correctly. I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
I work in IT, but I have a lot of IT issues with that. So.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so This is the list of the CSF categories in the 1.1, which is the last version of the CSF, moving into 2.0. Now, as stated, govern is the newest one, and you can see that there are some categories that have moved over. A lot of categories or subcategories, or I should say categories, yes. A lot of categories have moved between the functions. But some of the biggest here, some of the biggest changes is the introduction of the roles, responsibilities, and authorities in the govern section and the supply chain risk management category. So these two categories, essentially with the govern, there is a strong focus on integration of the cybersecurity risk management into the overall risk management program, as stated. And the roles and responsibilities category here is really its focus is to document roles that are throughout the organization, document what those responsibilities are, and then ensure proper enforcement of the of those roles and responsibilities, essentially. Now, the supply chain category here, that was in place already under the identify section, but there were a lot of subcategories throughout protect, throughout detect, and such that kind of, I don't want to say it was a mess, but it was a bit of a mess between the various categories. And the CSF 2.0 essentially has streamlined all these together into the supply chain risk management category to essentially enhance the governed function so that we can identify how to protect that supply chain, how to detect, how to respond and recover, and so on.
And I would just add really quick, Jared, is the kind of streamlining of the controls and the domains. I think it's going to make it really much easier to perform these assessments. For Jared and myself, who do a lot of these, for organizations, we'll oftentimes schedule interviews and conversations and kind of intake meetings around the different domains. But in the past, there have been really elements where certain roles or functions within the organization may have information around multiple domains. So I think for people, whether you're doing this internally or externally, is going to make it a little bit easier really to kind of, move through the process of performing the assessments.
Absolutely. All right, so the next slide, we will dive into the subcategory changes. Now, as I stated, a lot has changed with the 1.1 to the 2.0. So there were about 108 subcategories overall, and 79 of those subcategories have been moved, condensed, or dropped from the 1.1 to the 2.0. That doesn't, now I should state, most of these have been moved and condensed. There are 19 new subcategories. Now, as I stated, there were 106 subcategories with 1.1 and 108 now with 2.0. Excuse me. Now, because there are 19 new subcategories, there's only two more than were what in 1.1. Now, the reason for this is because while there are 19 of them, a lot of them have been condensed to streamline this process a little bit. So I'd like to touch on some of these key highlights a little bit. Now, let's start with the first one here, which is in the governance supply chain category. Cybersecurity supply chain risk management is integrated into cybersecurity and enterprise risk management, risk assessment, and improvement processes. Now, there were a handful of other categories that pushed into this. Previously, third parties, they did have to be identified, they did have to be prioritized and assessed. However, it sort of ended there on the cybersecurity risk assessment side, risk management side. This new control here, this new subcategory, if you're looking at the implementation notes, it requires that that supply chain risk management now informs the overall risk management process. And it also now requires that supply chain so the supply chain category and roles and responsibilities with any kind of third parties must not only be documented, but communicated to those external parties. So let's say you have a third party that is a SaaS solution that is hosting some of your data. We must now document what is the responsibility of that third party in the sense of protecting your data, but we need to inform that third party of what those responsibilities that we have documented are, and then we need to do continuous monitoring and detection to ensure that that is actually going to be enforced. And then lastly, there are now provisions that include planning for activities that occur after the conclusion of the partnership during the planning phase when you are first identifying these risks with the third party. So we need to identify who owns the data once that partnership has ended. Do we have the right to require that data to be deleted? Do we have the right for that data to be sent over? What happens to any of that data and any of that relationships information? Moving beyond that, like I said, the roles and responsibilities, these are streamlined a lot now. There were a lot of controls, a lot of subcategories throughout the various sections, throughout the various categories that require documenting roles and responsibilities. For example, there were subcategories stating that roles and responsibilities need to be documented for the recovery phase, for the response phase, for the detection phase. These have all moved into this single control now, essentially. It's essentially just to streamline it a little bit more. And as I said, it added the verbiage that needs to be communicated and enforced. Lastly, on the subcategories that have been moved and condensed, improvements are identified from the execution of operational processes, procedures, and activities. Once again, there were a lot of subcategories that were relating to testing processes, testing controls, performing tabletop testing for incident response, performing restoration testing of backups. And what this has now done is it has moved all of those various categories, again, those various subcategories into this one, essentially stating that we need to identify improvements and use them to improve the execution of processes, procedures, and activities. And these examples of all these, because examples of all these are defined in the implementation examples, which we'll dive into in just a few minutes. So essentially, these are what have been moved, condensed, and dropped, or the key highlights of them. Now, moving into the subcategories that are actually conceptually new in 2.0. The first is organizational leadership is responsible and accountable for cybersecurity risk and fosters a culture that is risk aware, ethical, and continually improving. Previously, leadership was always expected to be responsible for the cybersecurity program, but it kind of ended at the cybersecurity risk program. Because the new CSF has such a focus on integrating cybersecurity into the overall enterprise risk management program, this control really pushes and really tries to streamline the process of making sure that leadership is expected to push that risk-aware culture throughout the entire environment, not just in cybersecurity. One of the interesting implementation examples here is that leadership is meant to share both positive and negative risk management examples with personnel. And what this means is when we are looking at risk, we have identified what has worked to mitigate risk and what has not worked to mitigate risk. We want leadership to talk with the teams and make sure teams understand this is why we have performed these types of mitigations. Here are some examples of positive risk management examples that have worked, and here are some examples of negative risk management examples that have not worked. And that's really just to foster that risk-aware culture, just make sure that everybody understands why we are doing what we are doing. Moving beyond that, cybersecurity risk management strategy outcomes are reviewed to inform and adjust strategy and detection. This is very similar to what we talked about improvements are identified above in the last section. This is really just reviewing the risk management strategy through any kind of audit findings and performance oversight and make sure that they are actually informing the enterprise risk management processes. These next few here, they're going to be a little bit familiar as they're similar to some of the controls that were in the CSF previously, but they were reworked enough that we can consider them to be conceptually new. Under the Identify tab, inventories of data and corresponding metadata for designated data types are maintained. Previously in 1.1, we required, or well, NIST required that data flows and organizational communications were mapped, but it kind of ended there. There was an implementation example stating that this needed to be updated regularly. However, now the CSF has taken a bit of a stronger stance on this and wants you to document the actual designated data types that we are protecting, such as PII, personally identifiable information, PHI, protected health information, any kind of financial account number, any kind of intellectual property. Essentially, we want to make sure we understand what the data that we're protecting is, and then organizations need to continuously analyze any kind of new data that's flowing through the organization to make sure that we can identify any of those additional data types that may not have been assigned before. And then we need to assign data classifications such as public, confidential, highly confidential, internal, anything like that, through the use of tags or labels so that we understand how to protect this data and what the risk level of this data is. Lastly, on that, the control now requires the provenance, the data owner, and the geolocation of each instance of designated data types to be maintained. And that's really where that metadata verbiage comes in on there. Moving beyond that, under the Protect tab, we have installation and execution of unauthorized software are prevented. Previously, this was kind of vague. The CSF 1.1 required the monitoring of unauthorized software, but the 2.0 goes a step further and now requires restricting the execution of unauthorized software. And we need to make sure we configure platforms, configure assets to only allow the installation of organization-approved software that has had the source and integrity verified. So this will sound familiar because previously some of the hardening controls did state examples such as platform users on platforms should not have local administrators. So that should restrict the installation of this. Software did need to be inventoried. However, the new thing on this is really essentially using an allow list or a block list to maintain your software inventory. We here at TrustedSec always recommended prior to this to use an allow list to manage your software. However, the CSF now strictly states that users should not be able to install any software, and even if they can install software, there should be an allow list to block the execution of that. The last two we have here, the integrity of backups and other restoration assets is verified before using them for restoration. Again, this was kind of mentioned in a few spots stating that backups did need to be tested, restoration did need to be tested. However, this has now been an actual control stating that before you're using them for restoration specifically, not just testing them regularly, but before they are actually used for restoration from while remediating an incident, the integrity of those backups needs to be verified. Now, lastly, we have the end of incident recovery is declared based on criteria and incident-related documentation is completed. The 1.1, it did always require documenting lessons learned during the incident response phase. However, it did not specify that the lessons learned needed to be created before the incident is declared closed. A lot of the times, organizations, they will do some brainstorming after the incident. They will write up those lessons learned. However, now recovery plans, they must maintain a specific criteria to verify that these response and recovery actions have been implemented as intended. So we need specific criteria there, and these lessons learned need to be documented during the incident response phase to ensure that they can be used to continuously improve processes in the future. And this must happen before we can actually declare the end of the incident recovery activities.
And I think one thing to note about kind of everything Jared just went through is if you've been around the CSF for a long time, the things that have been added are really, I think, things that we've all looked at it and would like to be added. So I think NIST and the team that worked on this did a very impressive job. I think especially around risk management. I think that, as we talk to organizations, that's one of the biggest pieces. There's a few things that I oftentimes like to ask an organization to kind of get just a high level feel of what the information security program looks like. And one of them is really around how, cybersecurity risk or information security risk rolls up into enterprise risk. Of course, there are a lot of organizations that maybe don't have mature enterprise risk, but certainly when there, is a risk management function, just really understanding how the cyber risks are communicated up through that. And I think that's going to continue to be important, really, as we see, I think, a lot of changes in cybersecurity, where we're looking more at just so many legal requirements and regulatory requirements. And as we kind of move away from not just thinking about breaches, but also a lot about availability, right? And that's something that organizations are thinking a lot about. So I really think I think a lot of us are just very excited about the update to the CSF. Hopefully we're kind of among kindred spirits here that get excited about new frameworks. Makes this a lot of fun at parties, but certainly I again, to reiterate, I just think it's such a great way for organizations to really manage or start to manage an information security program.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. This definitely is a lot of stuff that we have been looking to see added, as you stated, Alex. And the best thing about the updates to 2.0 here is, the CSF was initially designed to protect critical infrastructure. We have used it to protect organizations of all sizes. However, it was always a little bit difficult with a lot of the wording, a lot of the verbiage, as it was originally focused on critical infrastructure. But a lot of these changes now, it really is great how they have streamlined these processes here to fit organizations of all sizes and all maturity levels and across all sectors. The CSF has really turned into something that it truly is something that will be helpful for all organizations, not just very large organizations, not just that critical infrastructure. It really is great to see what has changed here and what has been updated.
It's exciting. Let's say that. I feel like Steve Ballmer releasing Windows 95 excited about it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Ready for the next slide?
Yep, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about actually implementing the NIST CSF 2.0. Now, one of the best things that NIST has done here is their reference tool and their implementation examples. Now, the 1.1, they had implementation examples for quite a few of the subcategories. However, not all of the subcategories had implementation examples, and some of them were sort of difficult to decipher. This really goes into how everything has been streamlined here. Just some examples right here. This is under the detect tab, under the detect function, under the continuous monitoring category. We have two subcategories here. We have networks and network services are monitored to find potentially adverse events. That's kind of a broad statement. Obviously we want to monitor to find potentially adverse events, but what are we actually monitoring? So when you download the NIST CSF, or when you go to their website and utilize the reference tool to look at the individual subcategories, you can see these implementation examples, which essentially for this one states, we need to monitor for DNS, BGP, and any other network services for adverse events, monitor wired and wireless networks for unauthorized endpoints, monitor facilities for unauthorized or rogue networks, compare actual network flows against baseline to detect deviations, and really just identify any kind of changes in the security posture. A lot of these, especially these implementation examples, a lot of these are what we here at TrustedSec have already implemented into our program maturity assessments. We already asked before this update, we already asked about any kind of if you're monitoring for rogue wireless networks. We asked if you've implemented something like 802.1x to monitor for unauthorized endpoints. But the fact that they have put these into the examples here so we can read through these and really understand what how to implement these, what the actual purpose of these controls are, it's very helpful. Second here, the physical environment is monitored to find potentially adverse events. This is something that is always kind of lacking in security frameworks, actually managing the physical environment. We focus a lot on the network environment. We focus a lot on assets, but it's just as important to monitor and to protect the actual physical environment, as if somebody has physical access to your hardware. Well, it can be hard to protect against that. So, and as I was saying with the implementation examples here, now they're saying, monitor logs from the physical access control system, such as badge readers. Make sure you monitor any kind of failed access attempts. Review and monitor those physical access records, such as visitor registrations, sign-in sheets. That is something that when I am performing our program maturity assessments, that is a gap I see in a lot of organizations where visitors are not escorted when they're walking through the environments. They're not requested to sign in. They may be requested to sign in, but a lot of times their identification is not verified to make sure they are who they say they are. And then sometimes they're let in through the environment, and who knows what people could do. They could plug in a rubber ducky, or they could go into your server room if it's unlocked and be able to get actual access to your servers, to your assets. And really, this just comes down to this subcategory, just monitoring the overall physical environment, such as using alarm systems, cameras, security guards, and so on. So, I really recommend, while you are on your journey to implement the 2.0, look at these implementation examples. If you looked at them previously, as I already stated in 1.1, they may not have been very helpful for you, as a lot of them were difficult to read and understand. And I don't have the exact number, but I would say maybe only about 50%, maybe even less than that, of the subcategories had implementation examples for 1.1. But the new 2.0, every single subcategory has an implementation example, at least, or multiple of them, as listed here.
I think that's another just such exciting part. And I think if you look at a lot of the other kind of NIST standards out there, if you look at from the Android series, a lot of them have really great appendices, right? And I always like to joke that an appendix is not just a vestigial organ, right? That a lot of people have to have removed, right? It's such a great part of so many documents. And there is a lot of guidance there. I think that when you look at the old saying that a smart person learns from their mistakes, and a wise person learns from the mistakes of others. And I think if you replace mistakes with experiences, that tells a lot, right? And so as much as every environment's unique, as much as every organization's unique, a lot of the things that we encounter, or the questions that we have, are similar to what other organizations and security teams have had throughout the history of IT. And so I think adding these implementation examples is so helpful to just provide that additional guidance. There's again, working across just so many different standards and frameworks, you see some that are very prescriptive and some that are very vague. I always joke that some of these very vague, standards out there are written to increase consulting hours. But I really like, any standard or framework that gives very clear direction, very clear examples of how to implement. And I think it's very helpful, especially for anyone that may be getting started on their journey.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Isn't that the next slide, Jared?
Yep, next slide.
All right, got it. So, one of the things that we've been familiar with is the organization profiles previously that organizations have used. Although what's interesting, and perhaps it's just an issue of organizations that may be seeking help, is that we didn't see a whole ton of those. But really, with 2.0, the introduction of community profiles. And so when you start to look at being able to, have a good starting point, where other organizations that are similar to yours maybe selecting controls or how they're implementing them, I think it's going to be extremely helpful. A little bit more community, with that. What's interesting is, Jared and I actually talking this morning, and, organizations really, even when they seem similar, can be so different. Obviously, you would expect a software company to be different from a old line manufacturer or something. Of course, but also really when you look at organizations really in the same industry or vertical, even same, employee counts, maybe even in similar, making the same thing, they still can be so different because so much of security is the people and the processes that are there. And so, I think being able to, kind of share these types of profiles that are going to be geared towards the specific issues industries face overall is going to be extremely helpful. As noted here, they're available on the NIST website. We would expect a lot more to be developed over time, but certainly something that we should be taking advantage of.
Mhm. Yep, and we have an example of the organizational profile right here. So this really helps with creating the framework, creating kind of the path and the roadmap for implementing the NIST CSF here. So what we can do is, as Alex stated, we can create the current profile, which is essentially doing a self-assessment or, utilizing one of our assessments to go through the control list here, identifying, what the current status is, what the actual maturity of the status is. Just because it's implemented doesn't mean it's necessarily implemented, in the best way that it could be. So when and Alex will dive into that in just a moment on how we kind of evaluate what the maturity is using the CSF tiers. But you can use this organization profile here to just document your process and your roadmap, as it states here, what the current priority of each control is, what the status is, as governance is such a big part of this now. What are the policies and processes and procedures that are maintaining the individual category? What is the roles and responsibilities? Who is in charge of managing this? What is the evidence of it? And that's the green sections right there. But then we have the blue sections, which is the target. So we can identify, maybe a certain control is implemented, but as I said, we would like it to be a little bit formalized, a little bit more mature. We can put that into the target here and say, this is what our target priority is going to be. This is the target processes we have. We can take some notes in here. These are what the target responsibilities are. And then you can use this to inform that assessment process. And as we perform these reoccurring assessments, we can evaluate, perform a gap analysis of the current profile versus the target profile to identify, where do we need to get to and how do we get to there, to really secure our environment.
I think to add to that, anything that, we can do to really put together initiatives, to get to our desired outcomes is essential. Because oftentimes we think of assessment or audit as it's just kind of, describing, what's there now, right? What the situation looks like without, thinking a lot about how we get to where we want to be or even defining where we want to be. I think we've all seen that. I mean, if you pick any numerical scale, I mean, if you're rating or ranking things or maturity or what have you, 0 to 5, a lot of organizations don't want to be a 4 or 5 or don't need to be, right? You oftentimes have executives that may ask, well, we need to be a 5 in everything. And that can be very onerous and expensive and, affect a lot of business processes and just doesn't make sense from a cost benefit perspective or from a risk management perspective. So I think really, defining what your targets are and then allowing you to start to implement things. We get a lot of questions, I think, from organizations that, maybe have performed an assessment or they've kind of looked at their security program and it's kind of now what, right? There's a million things that any company can be doing from a controller perspective or even a process perspective, but which ones are the most impactful and the most important and really should be prioritized. So I think really, being able to help you put together a plan to increase your maturity is very valuable and essential.
Yeah.
Is that the awkward pause that means next slide, Jared?
Yes.
It is. All right. All right, there we go. So in thinking about, kind of the different tiers that are kind of used when we're looking at, the CSF, obviously defined through the partial, risk informed, repeatable, adaptive. And, really thinking about when you look at an organization, one of the things that we talk a lot about is existence versus effectiveness, right? So from an audit perspective, oftentimes, maybe looking at a kind of a binary conversation where it's, it's there or it's not. Even looking back, if you're a little bit older like me and remember, in the early days of PCI, DSS, it called for organizations to have a web app firewall, but didn't necessarily say what it had to be doing, right? So if it was sitting there, any, it was one thing, but looking at the existence versus the effectiveness. And it's really similar when you start to think about risk management and how we're managing risk, and then using that to inform your organizational profile. Because again, that's essential. Because if you start off just looking at every control that's out there and everything, and just decide that you want to have everything, that really is going to be a journey of futility. So I think looking at the overall risk posture and risk program is going to be essential. Anything to add there, Jared?
Nope, I think you covered that pretty well.
Okay. So probably the most exciting thing that we're going to talk about, something I think is exciting now too, but really, how do we move, to the 2.0, or really, if you haven't, used the CSF previously, how are you, going to start? When thinking through it, and again, just as in the consulting business and kind of what we do and talking to a lot of organizations, that's been a very common question, right? I mean, right now we're in a situation where, organizations, they're looking to have some help and guidance with the CSF, are really deciding whether they want to jump to 2.0 now, or kind of do one more year or one more assessment, with the previous version. And I think it's important to really move forward, sooner than later. Again, because as great as the CSF is and has been, it was, getting a little bit older there, and certainly, was ready for an update, right? And all the hard work that went into it. But again, I think because so many organizations use their scoring and use their, gap assessments or assessments to kind of report to management or executive leadership, where the program is and how it's improving and how the maturity is changing, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, right, to switch to a new set of domains and controls and so on and so forth. So how do you map them together? And one of the things is to that end is there are a lot of mappings out there. So a lot of people have put in a lot of hard work to kind of look at how the domains and the controls from the previous version to the current version align. There's a lot of reputable sources that have put them out. And so I think for me, thinking about that is really kind of performing almost a concurrent assessment. So looking at the diff between the two versions, and making sure that you're kind of assessing what was there, and then obviously the new parts, and then just porting them over, right? If for those of us, I think a lot of us in GRC love spreadsheets. So there's a lot of spreadsheet work there, I think, to get things aligned. And then really in the first year of switching to 2.0, if you really are using that, the maturity scoring and where you were to inform your your organization about your progress and your maturity levels, hopefully it's progress and not degradation, is really kind of showing both, right? So if we were assessing to the previous version, here's how the maturity changed, here's how that really lines up to the 2.0, and then going forward we're going to be using the 2.0. So really just making sure that we're able to continue to show that progress. Just as an aside, also talking to a lot of organizations, ask your assessor, or if you're doing them internally, ask yourself, are you going to provide that, right, as something? And I think it's important that companies are looking at both and then mapping them together. Certainly with the 2.0, again, with kind of all the resources out there, that's one thing that's, again, I keep saying exciting. Probably don't hear a lot of people get so excited about standards, but it's exciting. But really, having the resources out there to help you create those profiles. And once you've defined that, determining where do you want to be, right? Because again, whatever it is in life, we're not always striving to be 100%, or we're not always striving to be a 5 on a scale of 5. And really understanding, what our goals are, so that we're assessing against, the desired state, and making sure that the initiatives that we have in place are going to be directed towards that. You certainly don't want to kind of, slide in at a 3, and that's what you want it to be, and that's what you decided to be based on, risk, and et cetera. But then have people questioning why we're not a 5. So making sure that we're organizing that really well. But I think, again, that's one of the most important things, is just making sure that we're defining where we want to get to, and not just looking at where we are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I don't have anything to add in terms of migrating. I think you covered that very well, but I just want to reiterate it really is great what NIST has done here with the 2.0. And I don't know if we mentioned it, but the process from going from 1.0 to 2.0 really was a community driven effort. NIST, they had several calls for feedback on the 2.0. And essentially what they did was when they first started talking about moving to 2.0 and implementing this new framework, they requested feedback from the community as a whole. They had a lot of feedback about what people would like to see. They spent probably a good 6-9 months, working through that, and then they released the CSF 2.0 draft back in. I want to say maybe it was about October of last year. I might be off by about a month or so, but they released that initial draft, and then from the draft they requested they did another call for feedback. And you can view all of the feedback on the NIST CSF website. And there were over 100 comments, and with some of them very, very lengthy regarding, what in the draft do we like? What don't we like? How should it be improved? And the draft did change a fair bit from or I should say 2.0 did change a fair bit from the draft to the new 2.0. There weren't a lot of controls specifically added, but a lot of the verbiage in the implementation examples was changed based on that feedback from the industry and from the community as a whole. So NIST really did talk with the community. They really did want to hear, what are the threats? What are the concerns that organizations of all levels are really facing, and how do we address these concerns? So that's one reason I really am a big fan of the CSF here. Is it really is meant to help everybody, and it really did take that feedback to build on the CSF.
Outstanding.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you, everybody. We are, like I said, we know we said it a handful of times, but we really are excited about this, and we hope you all are as well.
Yeah. So if nobody else has any other questions, I like to thank Alex and Jared for their time in putting together the webinar. If you do have any questions beyond this, please feel free to reach out to them independently. And with that, have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.